Terraria has come a long way since it was released back in 2011, but as you'll soon learn, early versions of the game ended up leaking online before Terraria officially released, allowing us to get a peek into what Terraria looked like while being developed. And since we're on the verge of the new update, and I've never seen someone fully break down these versions, that is exactly what we'll be doing in this video. Before jumping into this, I want to make it clear that you shouldn't try and find these builds for yourself, as they were never officially released by Relogic, and you might even get a virus in the files you think are these early builds of Terraria, which is why I'm making this video, so that way you can safely see these parts of Terraria's history without having to risk anything. Another thing that's important to say is that I decompiled and slightly modded each of these builds, so that way I could make sure I was seeing everything in them. With all that out of the way, let's first start with the backstory on how these versions leaked in the first place. As you probably already know, Terraria ended up officially releasing in May 2011, but that wasn't the planned release date. Back in 2011, around this time, Relogic was still working on adding and fixing things in Terraria, but older builds of the game were being stored secretly inside of the official Terraria site, which ended up leading to someone finding and downloading those versions for themselves. The beta leak seemed to have happened at the start of May in 2011, but it looked more like an early build of what people saw in the reveal trailer, which it was. But the second leak didn't get the same treatment. In the same week that Terraria was officially sold on Steam for the first time, the pre-alpha build of Terraria ended up leaking up online, which some people ended up taking as the final version of Terraria and weren't too happy. After those leaks ended up happening, Relogic decided to go ahead and release the first official version of Terraria on May 16th, 2011. But those early versions of Terraria are still pretty interesting to look at. Now that we know the backstory behind these versions, let's take a look at them. We'll start with the pre-alpha build first, since it was way smaller than the other one, but still has some interesting stuff. The first thing I noticed is that there's no title screen. Once you load up the game, you just go straight into a world. Speaking of the world, it's also pretty different from worlds we have today, with it just being an endless forest biome on the surface, alongside some interesting world generation the further you go until it eventually crashes. Underground, you can either find really small caves or massive ones, until eventually you can't go any deeper because your game crashes again. And outside of its worlds and its vanity items, which I have on screen now, there wasn't much else to talk about here, so we'll move on to the other one, where there is a lot more to talk about. For the next section of this video, let's take a look at the second build to get leaked, which was the beta version. This version was a lot closer to the Terraria that was originally released, so I'll only be covering the things that are different from the Terraria we know today. Starting with the NPCs, we only have a few in this version, but the Merchant, Dryad, and Arms Dealer will have sprites that we never saw used again. One other NPC in the beta that's pretty interesting is the Demolitionist, which will actually have the sprite that was later on used for the Arms Dealer. Something odd that happened to me while playing is I actually got two Merchant NPCs for whatever reason, but they both sold the same items. As for the worlds in this version, you will only have one choice for your evil biome, which will be this corruption with an orange sky. And although the shadow orbs are in this version, there doesn't seem to be any corruption boss in the files. Moving on to the dungeon, it had this purple coloring to it, and after getting into the dungeon, I found it to be filled with Tims without their hats, which would later become a pretty rare spawn. Another interesting thing in this version is the fact the jungle is only underground, and the underworld is pretty different too, since there's no buildings, just molten lava ore, chests with loot you can find in caves, and ash. As for weather and invasions, you only have two things, which are the blood moon, which is a lot more common here, and the meteors, which also seem to be more common than they are in today's Terraria. The sun in this version also has a different sprite. But finally, the last interesting thing about the world has to be the floating islands, which will have a house made out of ores, and will even have the chance to combine with other floating islands. Moving on to the items now, we have the first ever version of a pet in Terraria, which was the yellow shadow orb pet. This was a pet that would disappear after roughly 15 minutes, which would cost a mana star to summon, but provided a ton of light. This pet would of course go on to become the purple shadow orb light pet we have today, which works much better now, other than with how much light it gives off. Two swords in this version were also different from the release, which was the fiery greatsword, which later became the volcano, and the blade of grass, which would later have its sprite changed. Another two weapons that got their sprites changed were the molten boomerang and bow, which now look like this. And finally, the last notable item in this version is of course the original Zappinator, which was an unobtainable weapon used for the developers to insta-kill enemies while testing things, so I actually had to mod this one in. That wraps up our look into the early builds of Terraria. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, I don't recommend going after these files yourself, but if you want to see what a beta world looks like, I uploaded a copy of the one I used in this video to the Steam Workshop, which I'll have in the description. Thanks for sticking to the end. Be sure to comment red slime to let me know you made it this far, and as always, make sure to have a wonderful day.